So the words under the radar and Rolex don't really belong in the same sentence. But today we're going to talk about why the 5-digit Explorer 2 is still so underappreciated and why it might just be the best sports Rolex you can buy for your money right now. Hey guys, I'm Max and welcome back to Hot Ones. So there are some watches, when you spot them on someone's wrist, you know that they're deep into the watch game. Now, it's hard to say that about Rolex because we're in a sea of Submariners and Explorers, but today I get hands-on with a couple of 5-digit Explorer 2s and we'll talk about why I think they're still so under the radar. See, here's my overly simplified take on sports Rolex watches. You have the 4-digit watches, which are a bit too delicate and expensive to be worn every day, and then you have the modern 6-digit watches, which tend to be a little bit big and shiny for my taste. And so that leaves the 5-digit watches from the 80s to the 2000s where they were still all about being tools, but they also have the modern materials and movements to stand up to a beating. So let's take a look at these two 5-digit Explorer 2s, and I'll tell you why I think these might be the best sports Rolex watches per dollar right now. Seemingly forever living in the shadows of their rotating bezeled cousins, the second generation Explorer 2 came in contrasting colors of black and white, aka polar. Produced between 1989 and 2011, the Explorer 2's chunky bezel makes it look like no other Rolex out there, and might just explain their under-recognized status. These dimensions is what I would consider near as can be perfect for a sports watch. The diameter is substantial, but not too wide, and the watches are especially thin at 12mm given the number of complications housed within. This, along with a compliant oyster bracelet, makes it what I would consider the upper limit of what's comfortable around my 6.5-inch wrist. Note, the end links do stick out further than the lugs. Let's get a closer look at the black dial. As mentioned, we have a 24-hour GMT function as well as a magnified date window. What I love about this one is the pop of red on a black background that's tastefully rebellious, breaking up the monotony of the grayscale. And this large steel bezel reduces the visual size of the dial, making it wear and feel smaller than, for example, a 39mm Explorer 1. Earlier models had drilled lug holes. This one does not. The Rolex Lollipop second hand and the Mercedes hour hands make their ubiquitous appearance, as not to depart too far from classic Rolex sports watch design. The engine inside is the Rolex Caliber 3185, which is the same as found on GMT Masters of the day. This 50-hour, 28,000 bph movement was later upgraded to the 3186 in 2006, when an anti-magnetic parachrome hairspring was added and a bit of wobble was taken out of the GMT hand. The black version, I would say, is the more conservative choice, easily paired with everything from jeans to dress slacks, and is also right at home on an outdoor adventure, which, judging by the number of scratches on these cases, both watches have been on plenty of. The complications included in these watches are some of the most useful, given this movement is a true GMT with the jump hour function. Now, interestingly, the Explorer 2 was never designed to be a GMT watch. Rather, the fixed 24-hour bezel plus the red hand were designed to work together to help cave explorers track day versus night when they spent prolonged periods underground. Now, before we get into all that, I want to thank you guys for supporting this channel. It takes a lot of work to put together a comparison video like this, so if you like it, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more like it in the future, consider subscribing if you haven't already. It really helps. Alright, so as I said, the 5-digit Explorer 2 is actually the second generation of this watch. Its predecessor, which is the 1655, was introduced in 1971, aimed at cave spelunkers. See, by the time the Explorer 2 was launched, Rolex had already had the Explorer 1 for 2 decades, and that watch traced its lineage to mountaineers, and specifically the summiting of Mount Everest. In 1971, Rolex was looking to extend the Explorer line with a more rugged watch, aimed at people who explored underground caves, aka spelunkers. Maybe it was the free spirit of the 70s, but the reference 1655 was a major departure from the company's conservative designs. Everything was aimed at making this watch more rugged, functional, and readable. You see, whether exploring dark caves or the poles, one can easily lose track of day versus night. So instead of using the GMT function to track time zones, a bold orange hand was utilized to tell the time on a 24-hour scale. Additionally, the bezel was fixed and not painted, as to shield the crystal from strikes against rocks. Admittedly targeting a smaller audience than mountain climbers, the quirky history of this watch gives the Explorer 2 something of a cult following. Now let's turn our attention to the polar dial. I must admit, when I first laid eyes on this watch, I thought it looked a bit toyish, but with more time, I realized just how photogenic it is. Now, for a couple years prior, we briefly had the 16550 with silver hands and indices, and by replacing these with black, everything became extremely high contrast, making the watch striking under a camera lens. A friend once told the story of selling his Polar Explorer 2 to a visually impaired gentleman because apparently it was the only watch that he could read. The Rolex fold-over clasp was good for its day and does feel secure once deployed, but we've come a long way since. This style really starts to make sense when you imagine having to read the time in a dimly lit cave where you need a rugged watch surrounded by rocks and hard surfaces. This case looks positively indestructible, in a World War II pillbox kind of way. Compared with the newer 6-digit Explorer 2, I find this style to be better proportioned, and without the oversized hands, offers better balance between positive and negative spaces. It seems that the polar dial is the more popular one right now amongst enthusiasts, and this might be because just how different it looks from other Rolexes. It takes a less serious and more playful approach, but for that very reason, the polar is a bit more restricted in terms of matching it to your wardrobe. A t-shirt is fine, but I think it would be hard to pull off this watch with a suit. I would go for this one if I had a sizable collection already and wanted an interesting watch that didn't need to cover a lot of occasions. And if there is one criticism for these watches, it's that the crowns are awfully small and they're sunken into the crown guards, making operating them a tricky proposition. But I guess that's the trade-off if you want to call yourself a spelunker. So having spent a couple weeks with these Explorer 2s, I think the best way to encapsulate my thoughts is to actually compare it to its cousin, the Explorer 1. See, if the Explorer 1 is a dress watch that can pull off sports, then the Explorer 2 is a true sports watch that can also do formal, especially the black dial. So it has less of a decorated history compared to some other Rolex models, but for that very reason, it also has less hype and therefore less pretension. This is a watch that you buy because you love watches, not because you want other people to love you for it. Anyways, let me know in the comments below if you agree and if you prefer the black dial versus the polar. So thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.